Good morning, everyone. I'm the chair of the Christian Learning Cluster, and we were delighted to partner with the McClendon Scholar in Residence program to bring Dr. Jennifer Harvey here to New York Avenue this weekend. And it's been a wonderful weekend full of a lot of rich time together, and I'm excited that Jen's going to have a chance to speak with all of us this morning. Jen's the author of 2 books, Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation, as well as Raising White Kids in a Racially Unjust World. Both really important works, particularly in this current political climate. And we're just really, really glad that Dr. Jennifer Harvey is with us this morning. Jen.
Good morning. I'm so glad to get to speak with you all this morning. And I want to just tell you, I'm just going to, I'm not actually going to formally speak. I am going to try and leave most of our time for some conversation. I am going to just share sort of 3 little ideas that I think help frame the conversation that I think we need to be having in all of our communities. But especially some of you were there last night, so I don't want to be overly repetitive, but I want to make sure we do have some context for the kinds of discussions we have. It's so good to see some of the young people here this morning, some of whom were also with us last night. So I told a story last night that I like to share when I talk about the challenging set of questions and issues and urgencies of raising white kids for anti-racism in a world that would like to bombard them and does with racism. And the story that I like to start off, because it sort of helps us get at some of what goes on in our racial understanding in America, is this one that happened about 2.5 years ago. There was a story that became widely seen on television and throughout the internet world, of these 2 4-year-old boys, one of whom was white and one of whom was black, and they were besties. And did any of you see the story? These 2 little boys, one white, one black, had gotten matching haircuts. And the story that was told on the news was that they had done this because they were wanting to see if they could trick their teacher at school and see if she could tell them apart. So what happened with this story was it got so popular, and I think it was partly because their friendship really indeed was just like sweet and beautiful and wonderful, and I think it tapped into this kind of longing that lots of us have in this country for interracial, multiracial, true love, right? But it also, I think, got a ton of attention because it seemed to be proof of evidence, like evidence that what I call white silence, and I mentioned that in the service this morning, white silence is a good parenting strategy, because it seemed to be like, oh, look, there's the proof. Kids can be taught not to see difference. And 2, if they can and when they can, that's a win. And both of those things are deeply, deeply false, and they're both actually pretty dangerous. And one of the things that I heard the mother of the white 4-year-old say on the news was that he was unable to see color, and that was a parental success because she had just taught him to love everybody the same. So one of the things I want to talk about this morning is why those wonderful words that sound like love are actually a form of very dangerous white silence, because this is, of course, a version of so-called colorblind approach to the world. And the reason I think we should start calling that white silence is multifold. One is that this is not something people of color do. People of color do not pretend we cannot see color, because, well, every single day of people's lives, they know that that's just a lie. And 2, actually, there's lots to be celebrated in communities of color about racial identity and the histories of resistance and creative, cultural, and political activity, and why would colorblindness be something we want? But part of the reason white families do it is because white identity is more complicated, right? Because if we are white and we value equality and we value justice, but we're living in this world where every day we see and experience injustice, and we actually benefit from that, it raises all these conundrums for us. So we're really attracted to colorblindness because we don't really know what to do with the white part. And actually, sometimes when we do diversity work, which I think more and more in our churches we're doing, and in our school context we're saying, oh no, we value diversity, we're going to celebrate difference, which is definitely major improvement over colorblindness. But the problem is it still creates this problem around white because we can't really celebrate whiteness like that. And there's all these conundrums that come up with that, right? And the thing is, our kids know this. And so there's these conundrums for white families talking about race and for multiracial conversations talking about race, because the white part is like this really vexed problem and challenge in the room, okay? So we get tempted to white silence, to abstract messages like everybody's equal. Yes, we want to say that we value the innate dignity and equality of everyone, but we are living in a world where equal access, equal opportunity is simply not the case. And so these abstract messages actually are very damaging to all of our children because A, studies have shown over and over again, kids don't know what those things mean, and B, those kinds of messages don't help counteract racism. But Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about racism being smog in the air. And so if racism is in the air, if you just tell kids abstract messages that don't mean much to them, oh, everybody's equal, and then they go out in the air, that's basically like saying, oh, look, I'm going to send you out where there's chemical warfare being on, but I'm not going to give you a breathing mask. Good luck. So anti-racist parenting is a set of questions around how do we build breathing masks. And one of the ways we do it is we start to break white silence. We got to teach our children to experience the reality, which is that we can talk about race, we must talk about race, we can learn what racism is, and most importantly, it's a normal and a good thing to fight it and name it and challenge it when we see it. That needs to become deeply normal for all of our children. It is already normal in a painful way, in a way because of the need to survive for kids of color, right? That's why families of color have the talk. That's why Asian American and Native American and Latino families talk about race all the time, because it's got to be normal to say, no, I'm not going to internalize racism. I'm going to challenge it when I see it. White kids can learn to do that too, but we have to break white silence to get there. So that's one thing that I want to talk about is just how do we grow our collective capacity to break white silence every time and start talking about race with our kids when they aren't not even lingual yet. We should be talking about race with our children when they're outside the womb. The second thing I want to share then, I want to give an example of, I don't often share my failures, and there are so myriad. So I'm going to tell you a successful story, but I want to really say to you there are so many stories of things not going well. But I like to give examples of like when it's like, oh my gosh, this one worked. I want to give an example of one of the ways that an early commitment to break white silence can develop over time in terms of our kids and our youth not only understanding race and racism, but also appreciating their own capacity to be agents for change and anti-racism in the world. Because sometimes white silence has been so pervasive that it's really difficult for those of us that have been raised in that or, however it's impacted our lives. We get a lot of pressure not to talk about race as white people. Other white people pressure us about it. We're like, oh, I don't even know quite where to start. So I want to give you an example of like, in my book I talk about is scaffolding. And so this was like over a period of like 4 years this happened with my now 8-year-old, but this child, my 8-year-old was much younger at the time. When my kids were, my daughter would have been about 3 when this happened because her cousin was 5. My nephew, who is black, had an experience at school where he'd been in class and this kid had brought a bag of Doritos to class and he was opening this just sounds so, as adults, like, he was opening the bag and letting other kids in the kindergarten class come up and smell the Doritos, like, because they smelled so good. I know, but Doritos do actually smell really good. So he's doing this. He's letting kids, come up and smell his Doritos. And when my nephew came up, this child snapped the bag shut. And he said to my nephew, "You can't smell them, you're black." And the first thing I want to note about that is that if or as we remain shocked to hear a story like that, we need to take that as important evidence that we haven't been proactive enough about realizing what goes on with children, because these kinds of things happen pervasively with kids. They play with race all the time. They hide it from adults. But if we adults are not talking about race with our young people, and especially even when they're young, they get this sense like, oh, I can't really talk about that. So this kind of thing happens all the time because kids are playing with what they see in the world. So anyway, my sister told me this story. She was processing through how they had handled this with my nephew, who was pretty devastated. And I just, found myself at first kind of having this like shrink response I was preaching about, like, oh, please don't let my kids hear about this. That's so painful. I don't want them to know this thing happened. And I was like, oh my gosh, Jen Harvey. So I was like, hey, H&E, I need to tell you what happened to T. So I told them, and then I said, I want to ask you, like, what do you think you should have done or would have wanted to do if you'd been there? And I'm realizing, asking questions of my children, like playing, like what would you do in this scenario has been one of the most helpful things for me as a parent of like helping them build a moral imagination for anti-racist living. And it's helped me build my own moral imagination. Because I'm like, oh, that's a great idea. They constantly kind of show me what I should be doing. So my 3-year-old said, both of my kids, when I told them what happened, were horrified. And they were like, what? And then my 3-year-old says, is that kind of what happened during slavery? Which I was like, what? Like, I would have never connected that. But later, when I reflected on all this, I realized, she was getting that enslavement of African peoples had to do with being black. And she heard in that story, because of what was said to my nephew, she made this developmental connection I would have never made for her, and it was kind of amazing. And then she says to me, my 3-year-old, she said, maybe she was 4. Mama, I think it must have been a white kid who did that, which I didn't said in the story. I just told exactly what I had been told. And she said, if a white kid did that to a kid who's black, I think another white kid needs to go up and say, stop being mean. And I was like, that is really an amazing insight, E. Like she was getting, like, for all of its vexed nature, allyship. Like, this isn't just general meanness, this is racial meanness. And so a kid who's on the insulated side of such meanness needs to step in, which I thought was amazing. Okay, fast forward like 3 years. And we were driving in the car one day, and it was not long after a person, I think it might have been Keith Scott Lamont, but I might have the name wrong, was killed in Charlotte, North Carolina. There was a lot of riots, there was rebellions happening and protest and intense outrage in the community. And I had the news on the car in the morning, which I sometimes turn off and sometimes I turn on depending on how intense it's going to be. And that day I decided to leave it on. And my older child said to me, listening to the story, said, Mama, I bet if you were in Charlotte right now, you would have a Black Lives Matter t-shirt on. And I said, maybe, you're probably right. I would probably hopefully be out helping folks say no and be with others who are protesting. And my younger child said to me, Mama, are all police officers bad? And I said, no. I said, they're not. And I said, but part of the thing we're doing when we're protesting in moments like this is we're trying to not just say that we believe Black Lives Matter and we believe that this violence against black people needs to stop. We're also trying to tell police officers, if you're one of the good ones, you need to make this stop too. Like, you shouldn't want other police officers doing this. And that's one of the things that we really haven't seen happen. So I said, so that's part of it. I said, no, not all police officers are bad. Lots are good, but the good ones don't often say what they need to be saying. They're not, most of them, yet doing what they need to do. And so that's part of why people are protesting. And then she says to me, kind of like that Doritos story. When another white kid should have gone and stopped that kid from saying, you can't smell my Doritos because you're black. And I was like, yes, it is like that. And I share this story again, like not sort of over naming, but victories in my house. No, so many failures. But because my kids keep blowing my mind about what they have the capacity to understand on issues of race and anti-racism. And what just grieves me, but also excites me about conversations like this is the chance to share that gospel message that if we could just empower and embolden our children and journey with them, they will actually lead us, adults, who are much more nervous. Not all of us are as nervous, but especially in white communities, we tend to be very nervous, to all these liberative postures. Like, in some ways, I feel like, and I was preaching about this a little, like, in some ways, my kids feel really, like, in touch with the pain and the devastation of racism, but also deeply free in a way that I think as a child I never really felt free, even though I knew stuff was going on. So I share that story because it's an example of scaffolding. The last thing I'm going to say briefly is just that as we talk, if I leave with you with nothing else this weekend, on all of these issues, raising white kids, working for repair, I would love to just galvanize and invite you all to build individually, but also collectively, your networks. When I think about the journey I'm on with my kids, I just tremble every day because it is so hard and daunting, and I am so sure I am messing it up. And boy, am I grateful that I have like 12 people on my speed dial. I do. I could name them. I think of it as like my bat phone. Who are the people in your life that are not just holding you accountable, though we must be held accountable because white silence is so tempting to those of us that have the luxury of succumbing to it, but who is going to love you up and help you brainstorm and give you ideas and encourage you to report back with how that conversation went with that teacher or that family member or whoever? Who is it that's going to love you up in this really difficult work? And I think one of the most important strategies we can do concretely in our lives is literally know, who is it that I'm doing this work with? And are they on my speed dial? So I want to really embolden you and invite you to think about building that for yourself as you are compelled by these questions and continue to be compelled by these questions of racial justice and repair and raising a multi-generational kids, generation of children and youth who are ready to live radical justice and love in the world in ways that, man, they really will, and all we've got to do is journey with them and stand behind them and thank them for being so much braver than we often are. So I'm going to stop there and invite you to ask questions, respectfully push back, share your concerns, all of it. I'm here for all of it, as long as we do it in love. So, yes, can you be very, very loud? And I will repeat. I want to make sure people have access. Oh, there's a microphone. Can we do that? I'm learning to think about access issues and my own hearing loss as I age, so.
So last night you mentioned, allowing our children to be heartbroken about this issue. And then you also just mentioned an example while you were talking about the news being on and how sometimes you have it on and sometimes you don't. I have an almost 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I find my husband and I, often trying to still shield them from the reality of the world. And I was just wondering, how you recommend people go about thoughtfully making that choice about what to expose them to about this issue and what to continue to keep at bay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. I really think that I like to think about this the way that we tend to think about lots of parts of parenting life. We all know if we have children in our life, whether we're a direct parent ourselves or a caregiver in any diverse set of roles, that we know, or at least we try to know, our kids. And we know that not all kids can have the same experiences and be well. And so I appreciate the question because I am not ever going to argue, and I'm not arguing, that we should all constantly bombard our children with the most intense news that's out there. I do turn off the radio around all kinds of things, and especially in the last 2 years. And so I think we have to make judicious decisions. I think the things that I like to think about are, okay, as I'm shielding, and I don't want to shield my children from the truth, but I do want to be, to the extent we can, age appropriate. And one thing we need to remember and know is that I know this because I've been in spaces where these conversations are happening. All families of color make diverse and judicious and different decisions from one another about how much and when and in what way. I mean, I've been involved with I have friends who've, talked through and let me be sort of bear witness to their discernments about when to have the talk and how to have it. And people make different choices. And so one of the things I think we need and why we need networks is because we need to support and contend with each other about how and when. And so a really concrete example of that in my life was when my kids were really little. I've always taken them to protests. I've never taken them to die-ins. I did, when they were really, really little, I took them to a rally in Des Moines after Michael Brown had been killed and Darren Wilson had been exonerated. And I told them why we were going, but I did not tell them that Michael Brown had been killed. I said that he had been really, really hurt. And I felt like, and maybe, when they're 15, they'll tell me I didn't do it right, but I felt like I wasn't fabricating, but I was withholding, and that was okay. But I also went knowing that there was a possibility they were going to hear that, and that I emotionally needed to be prepared that they might hear more information than I wanted them to hear. And as it turns out, they didn't. That part went over their heads, and what happened was my child ended up noticing during the rally, she started yelling, "Oh, black people aren't safe." And then she goes really loud, "Oh, we're white, so we're safe." And I was like, oh my gosh, shh. And I didn't do that. I leaned down and I was like, yes, that's true. And I said, but right now we're listening, so that she wouldn't cause more harm to the people in the space we're really grieving. But then in the car, we had this amazing conversation. She was like 4 or 5, about white privilege. I didn't use the word white privilege, but I was like, yeah, that's why we went, because we want everybody to be safe. So that moment, she got what she needed. The killing part did go over her head. But there are times, like, I'll turn off NPR. So I think we have to wrestle with that, be honest about it. We have to be wary that our concern about shielding is not rooted in a kind of innocence that isn't really innocence. And so we have to be constantly on alert for the temptation to white silence. But we also need to know that all parents make different decisions, and hard ones, about how and when, but it's never about whether. It's about how and when and to what sort of degree. So we need people to help us wrestle it, and our different. I mean, I have one child who can handle a lot, and another child whose own empathy and sensitivity are so high that, like, I need her to sleep at night, And so I have to really honor that about her journey. But we still talk about hard things, but in a different way than I might with my other child. Yeah.
So last night we talked a little bit about white identity, and especially as we are thinking this through and reconsidering it and teaching our children this. And I woke up this morning and I kind of had this funny thought. Forgive me, everyone, but this is a safe space. But I was like, well, hey, I'm female. So, I have elements of repression, and I can be proud and happy about the fact that I am female. But recognizing I'm still white, and with that comes privilege, but then I know my responsibility to, especially the young white men in this congregation, and thinking about, well, now how do I take on that responsibility in the commitment that I made at their baptism to raise them? And I was wondering if you could offer any other thoughts about that.
Yeah. I thank you for taking the risk of asking that question, because this is real, how our identities play out in a context when our identities are partly who we are and how we move through the world, and they're also all of our social identities are identities that put us in relationship to justice and injustice. And the number of times in my life where I have been like, oh my gosh, thank God I'm a lesbian, right? And that's easy for me. I mean, that's not really easy, let's be clear. I live in Iowa, but that part sometimes feels easier. And it's a real question, and we adults need it, but our young people need us to be with them on that. Because what happens is, and we talked about this a little bit last night, is that then when we just say to our kids, go celebrate diversity, and they don't have anything that they can justly celebrate, they end up really mad or resentful at kids of color. So that orange sheet that I passed out last night, and there's some more here, sort of has a map of racial identity development on it. Because what you're asking about is how do we support, in our own lives and journey with others I don't use this language, but some psychologists do, positive white racial identity. I don't like that language, but what it means is an anti-racist, committed sense of self that gives you some ground to stand on that's not just a deficit. Like, I'm only not operating out of white guilt. I'm only not a vortex that, sucks. Right? I'm a human being who can make choices about my relationship with injustice. And I think one of the things we need to do as adults and caregivers and teachers and folks who've borne witness to baptism is to journey with our young people and show them and live with them as we be a different kind of white person, as simple and as complicated as that sounds. So, for example, our young people need to know that John Brown existed, and Ann Braden existed, and that white people, like a sliver, The point of the story is not to overstate what white people did, but there have been white people who have lived against white supremacy. And they need to know those stories because in many of those stories is all this joy and dancing I was just talking about this morning. And they need to see us doing that. And so I don't just take my kids to protests. I also am constantly in spaces with my kids where they see that my life, which the more I've dived down in my life over 25 years into really serious anti-racism work in coalition with people of color, the more multiracial and desegregated my own life has become. And my children experience the joy and freedom and dancing that's always in those spaces. And so when my kids talk about whiteness, they know that they have moments where white guilt becomes a thing, but they also then go, oh, and I've tried to, we have this conversation over and over, like, yes, white people have done, and yes, white people do, and we are the kind of white people that are trying to take responsibility of that and trying to say, that's not who I want to be, and I am still white, but you know what? My whiteness hasn't determined my entire reality. But I never act like I'm not white either. Like it's this complicated dance. So I think we have to be committed, we have to be contending with that in our own lives in order to mentor our kids well. Because we can't just build it out of nothing. We have to actually be doing things. And the best antidote for white guilt and that vortex of whiteness is anti-racist action with others, especially across racial lines. That's the best antidote for it. So our kids need to do that too. And they need us to do it with them. And then, out of that, we're actually creating a new identity that hasn't existed before, which is what people of African descent have done, and diverse Latino peoples have done, and diverse Asian peoples have done in the journey of growing Asian American identities, and what Native people, that's what communities of color have done, is created new identities through resistance together. And white people can do that too. And something new will come as we do that. Thank you, Paul, because I was like, oh, man, did we really fix it all that easily? Whew! I better start telling my failure stories.
This question goes back to yesterday when you were talking about the reconciliation model and what might be called a reparations or Black Power model or something empowering model. And you mentioned that all of the curriculum, Christian education curriculum, is just riddled through with reconciliation. And I was trying to figure out how one would come up with a curriculum that was what it would look like for a curriculum that looked like the Black Power empowerment model, and I'm just curious as to whether you've ever thought about that.
For like young people in particular,
yes.
or in
Yeah.
general? Okay.
In general and for young people.
Mm-hmm. So I think one starting point. I mean, I have thought about it some, but not in a granular way, partly because the one time I wrote a curriculum about something in my life, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't ever want to have to write curriculum again. It's really hard to write good curriculum. So I'll hail the power to people who do that. I think what we need to partly do is, first of all, I think we need to, in the church and then in our larger educational systems too, tell all of our young people a fuller story about the history of race in the U.S., and we need to do it truthfully, and we need to do it with always keeping visible the ways that people have always resisted racism. And so, part of the story I would tell in a curriculum is actually our own church story. We talk about King in churches. We talk about beloved community. We also should talk about the parts, and our young people can handle it. They probably can handle it better than we do. The story about how much racial brokenness happened after King was assassinated. And we could tell the story about how within the church we have, had people of color in the church who are Christian have always raised issues of justice, and we in the church who are still siblings to one another have not always listened. Like, we could find ways to tell a more truthful story, and I think trust our kids then to ask questions and invite us, to sort of talk about that. That alone would reshape consciousness in a particular way, in a way that sort of this mono story we tell makes it really difficult then for like kids to believe other kids when they say they are experiencing racism, for example. So that would be one starting point. The other thing I think I would think about with talking about a reparations paradigm or repair is that I think one way to do that in curriculum would be to pair in a very explicit way. I think the church has some good groundwork here because we talk about diversity and we talk about, like, the Legos, that was gorgeous this morning, right? And it would not be a far step to go from that and align it in a curriculum with also inviting our young people to talk about the reality that, to put anti-racism next to it. So diversity with anti-racism talk together all the time. Because one of the things we've done in schools is we do a lot of diversity talk, but we don't pair it with anti-racism. And so partly that is why we end up kind of, white kids are like, what does this diversity stuff has nothing to do with me? And they don't see a constructive vision they can move to in a multiracial way. So if we could find, I don't know what it looks like in a sort of lesson by lesson plan, but if every moment we're doing diversity, inclusive, welcome work in our churches, which we do and we need to keep doing. Nothing I've said this weekend is about not creating inclusive community, just to be really clear. But to name it with how we build inclusive community is not just by representation, getting more diversity in our congregations, it's by committing hard to anti-racism no matter who's here. Like, that's what it means to really, really love diversity, is to commit to anti-racism. And so there's kid curriculums out there, I'm sure, that do some of that we could incorporate into the church. But I think someone needs to design it. I mean, I'm not really, like, I wrote Dear White Christians like 6 years ago. There probably is more stuff out there now, but I haven't really, it hasn't come in a strong way across my plate yet. So I think we need to design it. So I think anti-racism with our welcome inclusion vision is what would be more a repair model. And we can, partly do that by telling our own church story more truthfully in, like, our confirmation classes.
All right. You went out on a limb, so I'm going to try. I have 2 little white boys in addition to my daughter, and oh boy, feels a lot louder up here. Sorry. I have 2 little white boys in addition to my daughter here, and one of the things I struggle with is that at various points I've seen my little white boy recognize that his power is something he likes. Yeah. He likes the privilege that he has, and he notices already at a very young age that it's better to be white in terms of his ability to access certain things in the world. He's already caught on. And I've thought of framing it in different ways, but one of the things that I have had a lot of problems with in the last few years is the narration around privilege, to me, is one of loss, that little white boys need to have less privilege. But in fact, what I've been really bothered by is, in fact, I want everyone to be believed when they're stopped by the police. I want everyone to have a second chance. I want everyone to have the privilege that is accessed currently by fewer than the whole sum of things. And so I guess I've been trying to narrate that rather than as a zero sum, that something has to be taken away, that no, everyone has to get all this, and that's not a zero sum mentality, that's a better for everyone, yeah. That everyone should feel safe when they're stopped by police. Everyone, if they have a right to a gun, should have equal rights, not just people who are white. Philander Castile needs to have the same rights that anyone else does. Anyways, that's my starting point, but also just thoughts on how to talk about that in a world that sort of seems to be very zero-sum about taking away privilege from kids.
Yeah, thanks. I think I totally agree with you, and I think, like, in my experience of the story I told about my daughters at what she said at the rally, and then that was a moment where we were talking about white privilege, but the conversation wasn't like, oh, bad on you that you're safe and black people are not. The conversation we had was it was like, yeah, that's why we were there, because actually that's a basic right. Everybody should feel safe. And so we were there to sort of add our bodies and voices to that mass of humanity saying we all need to feel free. We all need to be free. And so that's one strategy. And I think the other thing that we need to do, because this discourse we sometimes have around privilege in disembodied spaces, as powerful and important as the internet and social media is for lots of things, I really do think that we need to partly counter it by, again, embodied experiences on the ground where our kids literally experience how delicious it is to be in robustly diverse, just multiracial space. Because that it is. Part of the reason that like there's so much loss around whiteness is because there is loss. Like white privilege yes, primarily harms and destroys and impacts and hurts the lives of people of color. But it actually really hurts us. We might get these social goods, but God, our humanity and our spirituality is so deprived. And so if we can find ways for our kids to experience, I mean, one of the most important things that can happen for white children, not in a voyeuristic tourist way to act, but in a real way, is to actually be part of communities where they are literally the demographic minority. So that first of all, they get decentered from the experience of running a room, because lots of our kids don't ever have that experience. And secondly, they also have the opportunity to create a different way of being with others that actually, I am convinced, is so far more inviting. I mean, it's a dance party. And so if we can't give our kids those experiences if we aren't creating them in our own lives too. So if we aren't desegregating our lives, this becomes really difficult, because abstractly it just sounds all like loss. We've got to literally, in our home we talk about filling each other's buckets. We've got to fill our bucket of experiences of love in radical, inclusive, just spaces. And so my hope is that the antidote to the ways that privilege all gets narrated as loss, and who wants to do that, in my own life, I feel like all I've done is gotten freer and freer and freer. My life is so much richer and more compelling to me than it was in my early 20s, when I felt really trapped and was really trapped in these narratives. And so however we do it, we need to get our kids in spaces where they literally experience that. And that is hard in a segregated America. We have to choose against segregation every day. If we don't make active choice, segregation will run our children's lives, because that's what happens in this country, through housing and schools in particular, and from there, psh. So we have to go looking for it, and it's gonna feel awkward for some of us at points. And it's gonna feel like maybe we're even invading. We gotta be respectful when we go into diverse, we don't just invade people's space, but we also have to choose against segregation. And when we do, and if we do it in a sustained way, I think the beauty that comes is so nourishing. I hope our kids eventually are like, why would I ever choose anything but this?
Hi, Dr. Harvey. Thank you so
Hi.
much for joining us this weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing up this notion of choosing against the segregation. So I think it's been often observed that for a lot of white people, their sort of commitment to racial justice sort of stops when it comes to the schooling of their children.
Yeah.
And the schools that they choose. And it's a very fraught topic here in DC, in the DC area. For instance, in DC, we have a lottery system for our schools. We can go to our local public school, we can apply for a charter school, we can apply for an out-of-boundary school. My wife and I, we have a 2-year-old, we're gonna be looking at this process pretty quickly. We have an in-boundary school that's majority minority. It's not a bad school, but we have the opportunity to look at better schools in different parts of the city that may be less, they may be less majority minority. What are some perspectives we can take to look at dealing with this question of where we put our kid in school? Mm-hmm. Should we, is there a justice component to going to our neighborhood school with those kids? I'm sure it's probably different in Iowa, the choices, but this is sort of something that we deal with.
It's not different in Iowa. This is a U.S. story.
Yeah. And just any perspectives or any thoughts you might have on some useful ways of thinking about that.
So the first thing I'm going to do is suggest you go check out, there's an organization called Integrated Schools that is trying to support and challenge those of us who are white and who are parents in sort of decoding the way we talk about schools, and how much they sort of argue, and they're really trying to connect parents to help to really interrupt this conversation in a loving way, but a truthful way, that the way we talk about schools is the new sort of most coded language we actually talk about race. And schools and housing are, like, those are the major conduits for segregation in the United States. So on the one hand, I'm going to just say up front, like, I am not the person who's going to ever individually scrutinize anybody's life and say, so anything that is coming from me as a fellow parent, not as like, oh, this is what you must do. But I do know some things to be true. I do know that our narrative about schools, yes, like many schools that are majority kids of color, are under-resourced, and so some of those environments have significant stress in them. But is absolutely the case that if we participate in the ways our schooling systems takes kids out of those neighborhood schools, there's no way around it. We're making a choice. We're making a choice for segregation that has other consequences that we might, for many good reasons, and maybe some parents of color make similar choices. But there are consequences in terms of not just racial justice, but the experience of race in our own children's lives. And some of the things that we don't sometimes see is the other gifts and beauties of being in a neighborhood school, in a multiracial school, and so this organization, Integrated Schools, I would just encourage folks facing those real questions to plug in with them, because they're sort of contending with that in a really powerful way and talking about things like, well, what does a standardized test score even mean? We have many schools that are really under serious stress, so I'm not downplaying, but then if that's the case, then are we really okay saying, I'm going to choose to let some kids have this experience? So again, this is vexed, but it's vexed and it's scary to even talk about, because it's like this, I think it's like the third rail in racial politics in the US. So I so appreciate you raising the question. And those of us that are having to make these choices, I just want to encourage you to really plug in with others, because the example, I grew up in a desegregated school being bused in Denver, Colorado, in a school that I got to go speak in a year and a half ago, and I got to do a third grade kid assembly, which was terrifying, but so awesome. And this school is now a neighborhood school, and it gets regularly docked for being one of those schools in Denver. And my experience in this school was just mind-blowing. It was so amazing, the teachers and the students. It was a majority black and brown, a bilingual school. And white parents that lived close to that school had mostly pulled their kids out of that school. We're sending them to a school that was a mile away because of the whole charter choice thing. And that school, they were in a fight literally in that moment about building trailers so they could have more classrooms at that school. And the school that I was in, I grew up, I went through first, second, and third grade in, every year's on the chopping block because they don't have enough students. And so their resources keep it's like this horrible cycle. And these white parents in this neighborhood were literally saying, we'd rather our kids learn in trailers because the test scores are high in the school further away, and it was killing this school where this amazing stuff was happening. But the public narrative was, well, it's not a great school. So one of the things Integrated Schools is giving parents some of the tools to really decode some of that. And so we all need those tools because the school stuff is really complicated and it's different in every place, but it's also in some ways the same in really every place. It's the same in Des Moines. So again, I say that with love. I appreciate the question, and I just think we've got to really decide what are our values and really see things. I'm not sure, white kids already get a hand up, so those are really urgent questions we need to, support each other in sort of really wrestling with in some profound ways. I have to preach at 11. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time. This is my last plug, only because I'm taking the Amtrak. I came from Brooklyn, and I schlepped 35 books in my suitcase. It was really heavy. I only have 3 left. I'm so happy to not take any back. So there's 3 books left for sale if anybody wants one. I do take credit cards, but I have to go preach. So.